A desperate child living on the streets confronts a powerful businessman with words that will shatter both their worlds. Before we start, let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching, and don't forget to subscribe. Will my mom die? The question hung in the sterile hospital air as 8-year-old Ethan clutched his worn backpack straps. Dr. Pearson knelt to eye level with the boy. Your mother is very sick, Ethan. She needs specialized medication. Then give it to her. Ethan interrupted, voice cracking. It's not that simple. The medication is expensive and not covered by insurance. Through the half-open door, Ethan could see his mother, Amy, her once vibrant face now ashen against the hospital pillows. How much? Ethan asked, barely above a whisper. Nearly $2,000 for the full course. $2,000. The number echoed like a death sentence. Their apartment in Boston cost $850 a month, and they were already 2 months behind on rent. I'll get it, Ethan declared with determination. Dr. Pearson gave him a sympathetic look. Perhaps there's a relative you could call? Ethan shook his head. There was no one. It had always been just him and his mom. Inside the room, Ethan climbed onto the chair beside Amy's bed. Her eyes fluttered open and a weak smile formed. Hey little man, she whispered. Hey Mom. Ethan tried to smile back. The doctor says you're going to be fine. Amy squeezed his hand, her touch feather-light. You're such a brave boy. I'll take care of everything, Ethan promised, a plan already forming. That evening, after making sure his mother ate a few spoonfuls of soup, Ethan retrieved the box of candies they had bought for his school fundraiser. The next morning, he left Amy with water and pills. I'm going to school, he lied, kissing her forehead. Instead, he headed toward a busy intersection, the box of candies clutched to his chest. Candy for sale. Please help my mom get medicine, he called out. The first hour yielded nothing but averted gazes. By noon, Ethan had sold only 3 candy bars. A woman in a business suit asked, Where are your parents? Ethan ran to another corner after that, fear of Child Protective Services adding to his anxiety. A teenage boy knocked the box from his hands, candy scattering. Get a real job, beggar, he sneered. By sunset, Ethan had made only $27. At home, he found Amy on the bathroom floor, too weak to get up. I slipped, she explained as Ethan helped her back to bed. I'm just a little dizzy. Despite Amy's protests about costs, Ethan called an ambulance. At the hospital, Dr. Pearson's face grew grave when he saw her condition. Her infection is spreading. We need to start that medication immediately. I have $27, Ethan said, holding out his day's earnings. Dr. Pearson looked at the money, then at the determined child before him. In that moment, Ethan wasn't just an 8-year-old boy, he was the sole protector of his small family. Let me see what I can do, the doctor said, taking the money as a down payment on a miracle both knew was beyond reach. Outside the hospital window, Boston's skyline glittered with lights from towers where people made more money in an hour than Ethan could make in a month of selling candies. Inside, a boy kept vigil, his childhood disappearing with each second that passed without the medicine his mother desperately needed. I can't breathe. The sharp cry cut through downtown Boston's morning bustle. Ethan looked up from his candy box. 20 feet away, a woman in an elegant suit clutched at her chest, her designer handbag tumbling to the sidewalk. People streamed around her, none stopping. For a moment, Ethan hesitated. Yesterday's meager earnings had convinced him to try a more affluent area today. But something in the woman's panic-stricken face reminded him of Amy during her worst episodes. Here, hold this, Ethan said, thrusting his candy box into a startled man's hands before darting through the crowd. The woman had slumped against a building, her breathing rapid and shallow. Are you okay, lady? Ethan asked, crouching beside her. Her frightened eyes locked onto him. I can't. It's like the air won't go in, right? Ethan said. Like your chest is being squeezed? She nodded frantically. You're having an anxiety attack. My mom gets them too. He took her hand. Look at me. We're gonna breathe together. In through your nose for 4 counts, hold for 7, then out through your mouth for 8. Ethan demonstrated, his small chest rising and falling in the deliberate rhythm Dr. Pearson had taught him. After several cycles, her breathing began to regulate. Color returned to her pale cheeks. Thank you, she whispered, smoothing her disheveled blonde hair. I don't know what happened. Sometimes they come out of nowhere, Ethan said wisely. My mom says it's like your body thinks there's danger even when your brain knows there isn't. The woman studied him, noticing his worn clothing and the dark smudges under his eyes. I'm Sarah, she said, extending her hand. Ethan, he replied, shaking it firmly. Where are your parents? His guard rose instantly. My mom's sick. I'm getting money for her medicine. He glanced over his shoulder at the man holding his candy box. Sarah followed his gaze. You're selling candy? Yeah, I need to make $2,000. Sarah's expression shifted. 2,000? What kind of medicine costs that much? It's for an infection in her blood. She's in the hospital. The mention of the hospital seemed to validate his story. Sarah reached for her fallen handbag and retrieved her wallet. Wait here, she said, rising with newfound steadiness. After retrieving his candy box, Sarah asked, How much have you made so far? $42.60, Ethan admitted. Sarah nodded thoughtfully. Which hospital is your mother in? Boston General. What she did next left Ethan stunned. Sarah extracted a credit card and led him to a nearby pharmacy. After a hushed conversation with the pharmacist, she handed over her card. The medicine for your mother will be ready in about an hour. The pharmacist will coordinate with Dr. Pearson to ensure it's the correct prescription. Ethan's mouth fell open. You're paying for it? But why? Sarah's expression softened. Someone once helped me when I needed it most. I promised myself I'd do the same if I ever had the chance. She handed him a business card. If you ever need anything else, call this number. The card read Sarah Reed, Executive Vice President, Millennium Investments. An hour later, Ethan clutched the precious medication package as he raced toward Boston General. For the first time in weeks, hope surged through him. His mother would get her medicine. Everything would be okay. In his rush, Ethan didn't notice Sarah watching him leave or hear her phone call. Jackson? It's me. I'm going to be late for the board meeting. Something rather remarkable happened. I'll tell you tonight. As she hung up, Sarah couldn't explain the strange feeling that her encounter with the boy was somehow significant beyond the obvious act of charity. In a city of millions, what were the odds of their paths crossing? Meanwhile, Ethan burst through the hospital entrance, the pharmacy package clutched to his chest like treasure. I got it, he shouted. I got my mom's medicine. As he raced down the corridor, the weight that had pressed on his small shoulders lifted slightly. Just for today, he had found an angel in the concrete wilderness of Boston. He couldn't have known that when his mother recovered, she would recognize the name on the prescription payment. He couldn't have known that Sarah Reed was connected to the man in the photograph Amy kept hidden. He couldn't have known that his desperate quest had set in motion events that would eventually bring him face to face with the father he had never met. Code Blue, Room 307. Code Blue. The announcement thundered through the hospital as Ethan reached his mother's floor. His heart stopped. Room 307. Amy's room. Ethan sprinted forward, the medication clutched tightly. Through gaps between rushing medical staff, he caught glimpses of his mother, her face ashen, her body jerking as a doctor pressed defibrillator paddles to her chest. Mom, he screamed, his voice lost in the chaos. A nurse spotted him and quickly pulled him aside. You can't be in here right now, honey. But I have her medicine. Ethan thrust the package forward. Dr. Pearson. The boy has the medication. The package disappeared into the room as the nurse guided Ethan to a waiting area. Hours passed before Dr. Pearson emerged, his scrubs wrinkled and damp with sweat. We've stabilized your mother, he began gently. The medicine arrived just in time to prevent the infection from spreading further. Relief flooded through Ethan. So she's going to be okay? The doctor hesitated. The infection caused your mother's blood pressure to drop dangerously low. Her organs didn't receive enough oxygen for a period of time, and her brain was affected. She's in what we call a coma. When will she wake up? We don't know. It could be days, weeks, or longer. I'm sorry, Ethan. The world seemed to tilt beneath Ethan's feet. He had gotten the medicine. He had found a miracle in Sarah Reed's kindness, and still it wasn't enough. For 3 days, Ethan barely left the hospital. He slept in the chair beside Amy's bed, used the bathroom down the hall, and subsisted on vending machine snacks. Nurses brought him extra blankets and occasionally shared their lunches, their eyes filled with pity. On the 4th day, Amy's cell phone rang with a call from their landlord. Where's your mother? Demanded a gruff voice. Rent's a week late now, on top of what you already owe. She's in the hospital. She's very sick. Look, kid, I've got bills too. If I don't see 3 months' rent by tomorrow, I'm exercising my right to evict. That afternoon, Ethan found their apartment door sealed with an eviction notice. The superintendent reluctantly allowed him 15 minutes to collect essential items. Ethan stuffed a backpack with clothes, his mother's medication, her wallet, the hidden photograph of the man he believed was his father, and his stuffed bear. Back at the hospital, Ethan hid his backpack under Amy's bed and resumed his vigil. He didn't tell anyone about the eviction, fearing they might call social services. But that night, the night supervisor discovered him. Visiting hours ended at 8, sweetie. Where's your guardian? My aunt, Ethan lied. She had to work late. The nurse frowned. We need to contact her. Hospital policy doesn't allow children to stay overnight without adult supervision. After the nurse left, Ethan wandered the corridors, desperate for a solution. He couldn't leave Amy, but he had nowhere to go. Near the end of a quiet hallway, he found an unlocked storage room with a small cot. For the next 2 nights, Ethan divided his time between Amy's room during visiting hours and the storage closet after dark. He became adept at navigating the hospital's rhythms, learning when staff changed shifts and which corridors were least monitored. On the 3rd night, as he slipped into the storage room, the light suddenly flicked on. A young nurse stood in the doorway. I thought I might find you here, she said. I'm Heather. I work the night shift on your mom's floor. Ethan froze, tears welling. Please don't tell anyone. I don't have anywhere else to go. Heather's face softened. You've been evicted, haven't you? When Ethan nodded miserably, she sighed. I should report this to social services. Please don't. They'll take me away from my mom. Heather studied him for a long moment. I can't let you stay in a storage closet. But my break room has a decent couch and it locks from the inside. You could sleep there at night and I'd wake you before morning shift arrives. Hope fluttered in Ethan's chest. Really? On one condition, Heather said firmly. If your mom doesn't show improvement in the next week, we talk about finding you proper housing. Deal? That night, curled under a blanket on the nurse's break room couch, Ethan felt a small measure of safety for the first time in days. Outside, Boston continued its relentless pace, indifferent to the boy caught between life and death, between having a family and having none at all. In her hospital bed, Amy remained unchanged, her mind adrift in dark waters. And somewhere across the city, Sarah Reed sat in her luxurious penthouse, still thinking about the brave boy she'd helped, completely unaware that her husband was the man in the photograph hidden in Ethan's backpack. We've located a temporary placement for you, Ethan. The Wilsons are experienced foster parents with a lovely home in Dorchester. Miss Caldwell, the social worker, smiled as though she'd announced a prize. Behind her stood a hospital administrator and Dr. Pearson, whose eyes conveyed silent apology. I'm not going, Ethan stated, gripping his mother's unresponsive hand. I need to be here when she wakes up. I understand this is difficult, but you're 8 years old. You need proper supervision. My mom is my environment, Ethan insisted. Dr. Pearson stepped forward. Ethan, your mother would want you to be safe while she recovers. The Wilsons live just 30 minutes away. We'll arrange visits to the hospital. How often? Ethan demanded. Typically twice a week, Miss Caldwell replied. Twice a week. Ethan's voice rose. But I'm here every day. What if she wakes up and I'm not here? We'll call you immediately if there's any change, Dr. Pearson promised. Can I at least say goodbye? Just me and her? He pleaded. 5 minutes, Miss Caldwell conceded. We'll wait right outside. When the door closed, Ethan leaned close to Amy's ear. Mom, I'm not leaving you. I promise. He kissed her forehead, then pulled his backpack from beneath the bed. Moving with purpose, he slipped out the door opposite from where the adults waited and hurried down the service stairwell to the 2nd floor. In an unoccupied physical therapy room, he found a window that opened onto the roof of a lower section. Minutes later, he was on the ground, running through the hospital's back parking lot. He didn't slow until he'd put 3 blocks between himself and Boston General, collapsing onto a bench, chest heaving. Reality crashed down on him. He had nowhere to go and couldn't even visit his mother without risking capture by social services. He pulled out the photograph he'd saved from their apartment, the only picture Amy had ever shown him of the man she said was his father. In it, a younger version of his mother smiled beside a handsome man with dark hair and confident eyes on a beach. She had never told Ethan the man's name, only that he wasn't ready to be a father when she became pregnant. A car horn startled him. Looking up, Ethan froze. Across the street, emerging from a black sedan, was a man who looked remarkably like an older version of the person in his photograph. Same strong jaw, same confident posture, though his hair was now flecked with silver. Without thinking, Ethan bolted toward him, dodging traffic. Wait, he shouted, but the man had already entered a glass-fronted building. Ethan reached the sidewalk only to be blocked by a security guard. Whoa there, kid. Where do you think you're going? That man, I need to talk to him. No one enters without an appointment or badge. Defeated, Ethan backed away. An elderly man who'd been watching approached him. "You looking for Jackson Reed?" he asked, nodding toward the building. Ethan's pulse quickened. "Is that his name?" "Sure was. CEO of Reed Enterprises. Owns half the real estate in downtown Boston." "Do you know him?" Ethan asked eagerly. The old man chuckled. "Men like Jackson Reed don't associate with sidewalk sweepers like me. But I've worked this block for 15 years. I need to find him. It's important. You'll have better luck at Reed Tower. That's his company headquarters over on State Street." "I'll find a way," Ethan said with determination. As the old man shuffled away, Ethan's mind whirled with the new information. Jackson Reed. The name echoed in his head, connecting to another memory, the business card from the woman who'd paid for Amy's medicine. Sarah Reed. Could they be related? Married? The coincidence seemed too great, yet Boston was a city of millions. If Jackson Reed was his father, and if he was as wealthy as suggested, maybe he could help Amy get better treatment. First, though, Ethan needed to survive the night. He headed toward Boston Common, where he'd once attended a concert with Amy. As dusk fell, spring rain began, gentle at first, then strengthening to a steady downpour. A police car cruised slowly along the park perimeter, its spotlight sweeping across the grounds. Ethan shrank into the shadows, certain they were looking for him. When the car moved on, Ethan made a decision. He couldn't stay in the open. Navigating by the distant glow of the city's financial district, he began walking toward State Street. Reed Tower. By the time he reached it, it was past 10. The massive skyscrapers of Boston's financial district loomed overhead, most of their windows dark. But one building remained brilliantly lit, a sleek silver tower with Reed Enterprises emblazoned across its facade. Reed Tower. Ethan stood across the street, gazing up at the monolith of glass and steel. Somewhere in that building might be answers, about his father, his future, maybe even his mother's salvation. Tomorrow, Ethan promised himself. Tomorrow he would find a way inside. For now, he discovered an alley between two office buildings where warm air flowed from ventilation grates. His last conscious thought was of his mother, alone in her hospital bed, and of the man named Jackson Reed, whose face had haunted the edges of Ethan's life for 8 years. "Hey kid, wake up. You can't sleep here." Ethan jolted awake to find a police officer standing over him, nightstick tapping against his palm. Dawn had barely broken, the alley still in shadow. "I was just resting," Ethan mumbled, quickly gathering his backpack. The officer's stern expression softened slightly when he took in Ethan's disheveled appearance. "You got somewhere to go?" "Yes, sir. My uncle is meeting me." The officer clearly didn't believe him but seemed reluctant to escalate. "Well, move along." Ethan ducked into a fast food restaurant bathroom to wash his face and change into his last clean shirt. His reflection was almost unrecognizable, dark circles beneath his eyes, hair matted from rain, cheeks hollow from missed meals. Outside, Boston was coming to life. Ethan positioned himself near Reed Tower, watching each person who entered or exited, searching for Jackson Reed's face. By noon, hunger gnawed at his stomach. He approached the Reed Tower security desk. "Excuse me, is Mr. Reed in today?" The guard barely glanced up. "Do you have an appointment?" "No, but..." "Then no information can be provided. Company policy." As Ethan returned to the sidewalk, he overheard two women in business attire exiting the building. "Presentation at Liberty Mall this afternoon. Reed's meeting the development team there at 3 to finalize the acquisition. Doesn't he usually send Harris for that? Not for a $100 million deal. Besides, his wife's charity is hosting that fundraiser in the East Wing today. Liberty Mall. 3 o'clock. Jackson and Sarah Reed would both be there." Ethan navigated Boston's subway system to Liberty Mall, a sprawling complex in downtown. The main entrance opened into a soaring atrium where a banner announced, "Annual Children's Future Foundation Benefit, East Wing, 3 to 7 p.m. A photograph showed Sarah Reed cutting a ribbon. A security guard stopped him. "Can I help you find something?" "I'm looking for the Children's Future event," Ethan said confidently. "Ticket?" "I don't have one. But Mrs. Reed invited me." The guard frowned. "The benefit is a private fundraiser. Tickets are $500. Please, I just need to talk to her for a minute." "Sorry kid. Rules are rules." Ethan nodded as if complying, then slipped away into the crowd. For the next hour, he explored the mall's layout, locating the East Wing where elegant women in cocktail dresses and men in suits were gathering. In the food court, Ethan watched a news report playing on a large screen. Jackson Reed's acquisition of Liberty Mall marks his company's largest retail investment to date. The screen showed footage of Jackson exiting a car. Seeing him in motion, the resemblance to the man in Amy's photograph was undeniable. "That's my dad," Ethan whispered to himself. Near the service corridors, Ethan noticed mall employees coming and going through unmarked doors. One of them, a janitor pushing a cleaning cart, left a door slightly ajar. Seizing the opportunity, Ethan slipped through. Following the sounds of activity, he eventually found himself near the East Wing service entrance, where Sarah Reed was directing volunteers. A catering uniform hung on a hook nearby. He slipped it on over his clothes and picked up an empty tray, pushing through the door with his head down. "Yo, boy, what are you doing back here?" The catering manager bore down on him as a security guard appeared. "This is the kid from earlier," the guard said. "The one without a ticket." Sarah looked up from her clipboard, frowning at the commotion. "I just need to talk to Mrs. Reed," Ethan pleaded. "It's about her husband." Sarah's expression shifted from annoyance to concern. "What about my husband?" Before Ethan could answer, another guard noticed the bulge in his jacket pocket, the photograph. "Check his pockets," the first guard instructed. "These types often work in pairs. The small ones steal while we're distracted." "No, I didn't steal anything," Ethan protested as the second guard roughly extracted the photograph. "What's this?" The guard examined the beach photo. "That's mine. Give it back." Ethan lunged for the photo, causing the guard to step back. In the confusion, the photograph slipped from the guard's fingers, landing on the floor where it was immediately trampled by a passing server. "No!" Ethan cried out, watching his only proof, his only connection to Jackson Reed, being destroyed. "That's enough," the security manager declared. "Get him out of here. And call the police, trespassing and attempted theft." "I didn't steal anything," Ethan repeated desperately, looking to Sarah for help. But she had already turned away. Two guards dragged Ethan through the service corridors and deposited him outside the mall's delivery entrance. "Don't come back, kid. Next time we press charges." Alone again, Ethan slumped against the building, tears streaming down his face. He had been so close. And now his precious photograph was gone. What he didn't see was Frank Martinez, the janitor whose door he'd slipped through, carefully picking up the trampled photograph. Frank studied the image, noting the familiar face of Jackson Reed. Well, Frank murmured. No wonder the kid was so desperate. Frank had worked at Reed Tower before transferring to the mall. He knew exactly who Jackson Reed was, had cleaned his office for years. He slipped the photograph into his pocket, glancing at the exit where they'd taken the boy. Something didn't add up, and Frank Martinez had never been one to ignore a mystery, especially when it involved a child in trouble. Hunger made Ethan lightheaded as he positioned himself across from Reed Tower the next morning. After another night outdoors, his body ached, but determination pushed physical discomfort aside. Today he would confront Jackson Reed. Around noon, a familiar figure caught his attention. Frank, the janitor from Liberty Mall, carrying a small paper bag. "Thought I might find you here," Frank said, approaching Ethan. "Figured you hadn't eaten." Ethan tensed, ready to run. "Are you working for security?" Frank chuckled. "No, kid. I'm just a janitor who's seen too many people fall through the cracks not to care." He offered the paper bag. "Turkey sandwich." When Ethan had slowed his eating, Frank reached into his pocket. "I think this belongs to you." He handed over the photograph, creased and slightly torn but intact. The image of Amy and Jackson was still clear. Ethan's eyes widened. "You found it?" "After they dragged you out," Frank confirmed. "Is that why you're so determined to see Reed? Because of this photo?" Ethan decided truth was his only remaining currency. "He's my father. My mom never told him about me, but she's in a coma now, and I don't have anyone else." Frank's face registered surprise, then recognition. "How old are you?" 8. Frank nodded thoughtfully. 9 years ago, Reed was just getting his big break. I remember because I started working at his first office building around then." He studied the photograph. "Your mom, what's her name?" "Amy. Amy Parker." A silent whistle escaped Frank's lips. There was an Amy who worked in accounting back then. Pretty woman, always kind to maintenance staff. She left suddenly. Hope surged through Ethan. "That's her. That's my mom." Frank's expression turned somber. "Listen, Ethan. Jackson Reed isn't the same man he was 9 years ago. And he's married now too. Sarah Reed," Ethan finished. "I know. She's the one who paid for my mom's medicine. That's quite a tangled web." Frank glanced at Reed Tower. "What's your plan?" "I'll wait until he comes out," Ethan said stubbornly. Frank checked his watch. Reed usually leaves around 6 when he's not traveling. Side entrance where his driver picks him up. He paused. "I've got a shift at the mall, but I'll come back after. Whatever happens, don't disappear, understand? I live in Charlestown. It's not much, but there's a couch if you need it." The hours crawled by. At 5:58 p.m., the side door opened. A security officer emerged, scanning the area before holding the door. And then, there he was. Jackson Reed in the flesh, more imposing than in the photograph, wearing a tailored navy suit, phone pressed to his ear. Ethan froze, his rehearsed speech evaporating. Jackson was already moving toward the black sedan waiting at the curb. It was now or never. "Wait!" Ethan shouted, bolting from his hiding place. "Mr. Reed." The security officer moved to intercept him, but Ethan darted around, racing toward Jackson. Jackson turned at the commotion, frowning. "Cancel the call," he instructed the person on the phone. "Mr. Reed." Ethan gasped, the security guard's hand now firmly on his shoulder. "Please, I need to talk to you." "It's all right, Thomas," Jackson told the guard. "What can I do for you, young man?" The moment stretched between them, the powerful CEO and the homeless boy, connected by invisible threads of DNA. Ethan reached into his pocket, hands trembling as he withdrew the photograph. "My name is Ethan Parker. My mother is Amy Parker." He thrust the photograph forward. "And she said you're my dad." The color drained from Jackson's face as he stared at the beach photograph. "Where did you get this?" "My mom kept it. She never told you about me because you left before she found out she was pregnant. She's sick, in a coma at Boston General. I don't have anyone else." Jackson stood frozen, the photograph in his hands. Behind him, the sedan door opened from the inside. Sarah Reed emerged, elegant in a cream-colored business suit. "Jackson? What's going on?" Her gaze moved from her husband's shocked face to Ethan's desperate one. "Mrs. Reed." Ethan gasped. "You helped me. You paid for my mom's medicine at the pharmacy." Recognition dawned in Sarah's eyes. "You're the boy from downtown. The one having the panic attack." "Yes. That medicine was for my mom, Amy. But she got worse and fell into a coma, and then we got evicted and I've been trying to find him." Ethan gestured toward Jackson. "Because he's my father." Sarah's hand flew to her mouth. "Jackson? What is he talking about? You know this boy's mother?" Sarah demanded, her voice tight. Jackson hesitated, then reluctantly nodded. "Amy Parker worked for me years ago. Before we met." "And the rest of what he's claiming?" "I don't know," Jackson admitted, glancing back at the photograph. "It's possible." Pedestrians had begun to slow, watching the unfolding drama. A woman with a phone was recording the scene. "Not here," Jackson insisted. To Ethan he said, "You'll come with us and we'll sort this out." "I'm not going anywhere until you explain what's happening," Sarah declared, arms crossed. "Sarah, please. There are cameras." "I don't care about cameras. I care about this child claiming to be your son." "I don't know if he's my son," Jackson hissed. "But yes, I knew his mother. We were involved briefly." "I'll take a DNA test," Ethan interjected. "Dr. Pearson at Boston General can do it." "Fine," Sarah said coldly. "A DNA test. Tonight." As they walked toward the parking garage, Ethan caught a glimpse of Frank watching from across the street. The janitor gave him a subtle nod before disappearing into the crowd. In the luxury sedan, silence reigned. Jackson stared out the window, the photograph still in his hand. Sarah sat rigidly, as far from her husband as the back seat allowed. And Ethan, caught between these two strangers whose lives he had just upended, wondered if he had made the biggest mistake of his young life. The hospital corridor stretched before them like neutral territory. Jackson strode ahead, arranging for a DNA test by phone. Sarah walked several paces behind, her heels clicking against the tile floor. Ethan trailed them both, uncertain of his place. Dr. Pearson met them outside Amy's room, surprised to see Ethan with Boston's elite. "Ethan? We've been looking everywhere for you. Ms. Caldwell from Social Services has been frantic." "This is Jackson Reed," Ethan interrupted. "And his wife, Sarah. She's the one who paid for Mom's medicine." "Mr. and Mrs. Reed. I wasn't aware you had a connection to the Parkers." "Neither was I," Sarah muttered. Jackson cleared his throat. "Doctor, we need a DNA test performed. Tonight." "I'll make arrangements. But first, perhaps you'd like to see Miss Parker?" The room was quiet save for monitoring equipment. Amy lay unchanged, her chest rising and falling with mechanical precision. Jackson stopped in the doorway. "She looks so different," he whispered. Sarah moved closer to the bed, studying Amy's face. "How long has she been in this condition?" "Almost 2 weeks now," Dr. Pearson replied. "The infection was severe, but thanks to the medication she received, we prevented it from spreading further." "Will she wake up?" Ethan asked. Dr. Pearson's expression softened. "We have every reason to hope, Ethan." A nurse appeared. "Dr. Pearson? The lab is ready for the samples." In a small examination room, Dr. Pearson swabbed the insides of both Ethan's and Jackson's cheeks. "We should have preliminary results within a few hours." "How much will this cost?" Ethan asked anxiously. "Don't worry about that," Jackson said, handing a credit card to the nurse. "I'm covering all expenses." Back in the hospital lobby, an awkward silence fell over the trio. Sarah finally broke it. "I need coffee," she announced. "And some answers." Once seated, Sarah fixed her gaze on Jackson. "Tell me everything and don't you dare lie to me again." "I haven't lied," Jackson began. "Omission is lying," Sarah snapped. 9 years of marriage and you never once mentioned Amy Parker or the possibility of a child. There's nothing to tell. Amy worked in accounting at my first company. We dated briefly before I met you. It ended, she left the company and I never heard from her again. You never asked why she left so suddenly? It was a mutual decision to end things, Jackson said, but his eyes slid away. The company was taking off, I was working 80-hour weeks. And you never knew about me? Ethan asked. Jackson turned to him, guilt flickering across his face. No. She never told me she was pregnant. You would have what? Sarah challenged. Supported them financially? Been a father? Or just written checks from a distance? That's not fair, Sarah. None of this is fair. Especially not to this child who's been sleeping on the streets while his mother lies in a coma. Jackson's eyes widened. Sleeping on the streets? Ethan, is that true? Ethan nodded uncomfortably. We got evicted after Mom got sick. I was staying at the hospital, but then social services found out and I ran away. Frank arrived, still in his mall maintenance uniform. Ethan? I've been looking all over for you, Frank said, approaching their table. Then, recognizing the couple, he hesitated. Mr. Reed, Mrs. Reed. I didn't expect to see you here. Frank? Jackson frowned. What are you doing here? You know each other? Ethan asked, surprised. Frank used to work at Reed Tower, Jackson explained. I returned something that belonged to him, Frank said, glancing at Ethan. The photograph. The beach photo? Jackson questioned. You had it all along? No, sir. Ethan had it. It fell during an incident at the mall. Sarah's eyes narrowed. You recognized my husband with Amy Parker? From 9 years ago? Frank shifted uncomfortably. Yes, ma'am. I've worked for Mr. Reed's companies for 12 years. I remember when Miss Parker was in accounting. Apparently it was everyone's business but mine, Sarah said bitterly. Jackson's phone rang. It's Dr. Pearson. He answered, listening for several moments. The preliminary results are ready. Inside the office, Dr. Pearson's expression was professionally neutral as he reviewed the report. We ran the comparison twice to be certain, he began. The results indicate a 99.9% probability that Jackson Reed is Ethan Parker's biological father. The words landed like physical blows. Sarah closed her eyes, absorbing the confirmation. Jackson sank into a chair, the last of his denials evaporating. And Ethan stood very still, a mixture of vindication and uncertainty washing over him. So it's true, he whispered. You really are my dad. Jackson met his gaze, truly seeing him for the first time. The shape of the eyes so like his own, the determined set of the jaw, the resilience that had carried this child through hardships no 8-year-old should endure. Yes, he finally admitted, his voice rough with emotion. It seems I am. Sarah rose abruptly. I need some air. Without waiting for a response, she left the room. I'm sorry, Jackson said finally. I'm sorry I wasn't there. Did you love her? Ethan asked. My mom? Jackson's gaze drifted to the window. I cared for her. But I was ambitious, focused on my career. When she left, I told myself it was for the best. She never asked you for anything, Ethan said, a hint of pride in his voice. She always said we were fine on our own. She shouldn't have had to do it alone. Jackson's voice was heavy with regret, not just for Amy and Ethan, but for the future with Sarah that now hung in precarious balance. Outside, Sarah leaned against the wall, tears streaming silently down her face, for the child who had suffered needlessly, for the woman lying unconscious down the hall, and for her own shattered illusions about the man she had married. "Are you sure about this, Mr. Reed? It's highly irregular." Ms. Caldwell from Social Services tapped her pen against her clipboard. "I understand your concerns," Jackson replied firmly. "But the DNA test confirms I'm Ethan's biological father. He belongs with family, not in the system." They stood in the hospital conference room where Jackson had insisted on meeting rather than the dreary social services office. 3 days had passed since the DNA test results. "Temporary guardianship requires significant paperwork," Ms. Caldwell persisted. "All of which my lawyers are expediting," Jackson cut in. "In the meantime, Ethan will stay with me and my wife." He hesitated. "At our guest house. And Mrs. Reed is in agreement with this arrangement?" A muscle in Jackson's jaw twitched. "Mrs. Reed understands the situation." Understanding was a generous description of Sarah's current state. She had spent the past 3 days alternating between icy silence and blistering anger, sleeping in their penthouse's spare bedroom. She had, however, not forbidden Ethan from staying on their property, a concession Jackson recognized as arising from her compassion for the boy rather than forgiveness for himself. After signing the necessary forms, Jackson found Ethan in Amy's hospital room. The boy looked up when Jackson entered, his expression guarded yet hopeful. "Miss Caldwell says I can stay with you," Ethan said, somewhere between a question and an affirmation. Jackson nodded. "At our guest house in Brookline. It's small but comfortable." "What about Mom?" "I can't leave her alone. You'll visit every day after school, and I've arranged for specialists to consult on her case. She's receiving round-the-clock care, Ethan." Ethan's hand remained firmly wrapped around his mother's. "What if she wakes up and I'm not here?" "The hospital will call immediately and I'll bring you straight here day or night," Jackson promised. "Thank you." The simple gratitude struck Jackson like a physical blow. This child, his son, was thanking him for basic decency, for doing a fraction of what should have been done years ago. "Is there anything special you'd like at the guest house?" Ethan considered the question with a seriousness beyond his years. "Could I have pictures of my mom? And maybe some of her things from our apartment?" "Of course. I'll send someone to retrieve whatever wasn't lost in the eviction." The drive to Brookline was silent, Ethan gazing wide-eyed at neighborhoods that grew progressively more affluent. When they turned into a private drive flanked by stone pillars, his mouth fell open at the sight of the main house, a sprawling Tudor mansion surrounded by manicured gardens. "You live here?" he whispered. "Yes," Jackson replied, feeling suddenly self-conscious about his wealth. "The guest house is just beyond that grove of trees." The guest house proved to be a charming cottage that would have fit their entire apartment inside with room to spare. "Your room is upstairs," Jackson explained, leading Ethan to a bedroom with a view of the garden. "I had some clothes delivered, but we'll go shopping properly tomorrow." Left alone, Ethan sat on the edge of the bed, trying to reconcile his new reality with everything that had come before. Just days ago, he'd been sleeping in a hospital storage closet. Now he was the acknowledged son of one of Boston's wealthiest men. Yet his mother remained unconscious, her future uncertain. And his place in this new world felt tenuous at best, especially given Sarah's barely concealed resentment. In the main house, Sarah was having similar thoughts as she mechanically arranged place settings for dinner. 3 plates instead of 2. A family dinner with a family member she hadn't known existed a week ago. "Need any help?" Jackson asked, entering the kitchen cautiously. "I think you've helped quite enough," Sarah replied frostily. "Is he settled in?" "Yes." "It's a lot for him to process." "For all of us," Sarah corrected, finally meeting his gaze. "What's your long-term plan here, Jackson? Because I'm still struggling to understand where I fit in this new reality of yours." "Our reality," Jackson said quietly. "I know you're angry. Angry doesn't begin to cover it. You had a child with another woman and never told me. It was before us, Sarah. I didn't think it mattered." "Well, it matters now," she said, slamming a drawer shut. "Now we have an 8-year-old boy living in our guest house and a woman you once loved lying in a hospital bed." "I never said I loved Amy," Jackson protested. Sarah's laugh was hollow. "You didn't have to. I saw your face when you first saw her." Before Jackson could answer, the doorbell rang. It was Frank Martinez carrying a cardboard box. "Mr. Reed, Mrs. Reed," he greeted them formally. "I spoke with the superintendent at Ethan and Miss Parker's old building. He had these items in storage, things the landlord didn't auction after the eviction." "Thank you, Frank," Sarah said, accepting the box. "That was very thoughtful." Frank shifted uncomfortably. There's something else. The hospital called. Ms. Parker showed increased brain activity this afternoon. Dr. Pearson thinks she might be emerging from the coma. The news rippled through the kitchen like an electric current. I'll tell Ethan, Jackson said, already moving toward the door. No, Sarah stopped him. Let me. In the guest house, Sarah found Ethan curled on the bed, clutching his backpack like a lifeline. She sat beside him, the box in her lap. Frank brought some things from your apartment, she said gently. And there's news about your mom. Good news. As she explained the development, Ethan's entire being seemed to light up with hope. Sarah found herself smiling in response, her resentment temporarily forgotten. Later that evening, after a stilted dinner, Jackson retreated to his study. There, surrounded by the trappings of his success, he opened his laptop and began typing an email to his board of directors. Personal circumstances require my immediate attention. I'll be taking a leave of absence. His finger hovered over the send button as the magnitude of the change struck him. 9 years ago, he had chosen ambition over Amy, career over potential fatherhood. Now, faced with the consequences of that choice, he found himself at another crossroads. In her bedroom, Sarah removed her jewelry and stared at her reflection, wondering who exactly she was becoming in this new narrative. The wronged wife? The reluctant stepmother? Or perhaps something else entirely, a woman faced with an impossible situation who could choose compassion over bitterness. And in the guest house, Ethan lay beneath his mother's hand-knit blanket, pictures of Amy arranged on the nightstand beside him. He was caught between worlds, the struggling existence he'd known with his mother and this new realm of privilege with a father he'd just met and a stepmother who hadn't signed up for his presence in her life. 3 lives disrupted, 3 identities in flux, all spinning around the silent center that was Amy Parker, whose awakening or eternal sleep would redefine them all. Two weeks passed in an uneasy rhythm. Each morning, Jackson drove Ethan to the private school where he'd been hastily enrolled. Each afternoon, they visited Amy at the hospital, where she continued to show signs of emerging consciousness. Each evening, they returned to the Brookline estate, where Sarah maintained a polite distance. The facade cracked one rainy afternoon as Sarah worked from home. A knock at her office door revealed Ethan, soaking wet from the rain. "I'm sorry to bother you," he said. "Jackson had an emergency meeting, and Heather's shift at the hospital doesn't start until 5, so we came back early." Sarah set aside her laptop. "You're drenched. Come in, let me find you a towel." As she helped him dry off, Sarah noticed for the first time how his expressions mirrored Jackson's. The way his forehead creased when concentrating, the determined set of his jaw. "You look like him," she said quietly. Ethan glanced up, surprised. "Do I? Mom always said I had her eyes." "You do," Sarah agreed. "But the rest is all Jackson." She hesitated. "Are you thinking hard about something?" Ethan nodded slowly. "I found this in Mom's things." He pulled a folded envelope from his pocket. "It's addressed to Jackson, but it was never sent." Sarah's breath caught. "Have you read it?" "No. It's sealed. But I think it might be about me." The envelope sat between them on the table, a time capsule from a past that refused to stay buried. "What should I do with it?" Ethan asked. Sarah studied the boy, his earnest expression, his obvious internal struggle. "That depends," she said carefully. "Are you hoping it contains answers, or are you afraid of what those answers might be?" "Both, I guess." Ethan's fingers fidgeted with the envelope's edge. What if she did tell him about me and he just didn't want us? The vulnerability in his question pierced Sarah's carefully maintained armor. "Oh, Ethan. Is that what you've been worrying about?" "I think," Sarah said, choosing her words deliberately, "that Jackson should see this letter. And I think you deserve to know what it says." That evening, after Ethan had gone to the guest house, Sarah placed the envelope on the kitchen island where Jackson was reviewing documents. "Ethan found this in Amy's possessions," she said simply. "It's addressed to you. Never sent." With trembling fingers, Jackson opened the envelope, unfolding several pages of lined paper. As he read, the color drained from his face. "Jackson," Sarah prompted. "What does it say?" He pushed the pages toward her, unable to speak. The letter was dated 8 years ago, shortly after Ethan's birth. "Jackson, by the time you read this, if you ever do, our son will be a month old." "Yes, our son. His name is Ethan and he has your smile already. I've started this letter a dozen times since I learned I was pregnant." Each version ends up in the trash because I can't find the right words to tell a man who walked away that he's a father. I'm not writing to ask for money or to disrupt your life. I'm writing because someday Ethan will ask about his father, and I want to be honest without being bitter. I want to tell him his father was ambitious and brilliant, if not ready for a family. I want to say you would have loved him if you'd known him. But I'm afraid that's not true. I'm afraid you knew exactly what might happen when you left, when you said having a family would derail everything you were working toward. I saw your face that night when I mentioned wanting children someday. So I'll keep this letter, perhaps forever. And I'll raise our son to be the kind of man who doesn't run from responsibility, who understands that real success isn't measured in property acquisitions or investment portfolios, but in the lives you touch and the love you give. Aimee. Sarah looked up from the letter, tears streaming down her face. You knew, she whispered. You suspected she might be pregnant when you left her. Jackson's shoulders slumped in defeat. I didn't know for certain. She hinted at the possibility and I panicked. I was 26, barely keeping my first development project afloat, working 100-hour weeks. A child would have meant sacrificing everything I was building. So you sacrificed them instead. I told myself she would be better off without me, Jackson said, his voice hollow. That if she was pregnant, she deserved someone more stable, more ready for fatherhood. And then you never looked back, Sarah said. You never checked to see if she was pregnant. You deliberately avoided knowing. Yes. The admission hung heavy between them. When my first project succeeded, I thought about finding her. But by then it had been over a year. I told myself it was too late. Or disrupt yours, Sarah countered. We met right around then, didn't we? The charity gala for urban development. Jackson nodded miserably. You were brilliant, passionate about your causes. Everything clicked with you. My past seemed irrelevant. It wasn't irrelevant to Amy. Or to Ethan. Sarah stood, pacing the kitchen. All these years I thought I knew you. But there was this whole other person beneath the surface. Someone who could walk away from a pregnant girlfriend because she inconvenienced your 5-year plan. I was wrong, Jackson admitted, his voice breaking. Seeing him now, knowing what they went through. I've never been more ashamed of any decision in my life. Sarah stopped pacing, studying her husband with new eyes. In 8 years of marriage, she had never seen him so completely stripped of pretense. I'm not sure I know how to forgive this, she said honestly. I'm not sure I deserve forgiveness, he replied. But Ethan does deserve the truth. And a father who won't run away this time. A soft knock interrupted them. Ethan stood in the doorway, uncertainty written across his features. I heard voices, he explained. Did you read it? Jackson nodded, tears in his eyes. Yes. We need to talk, Ethan. About your mother, about the past, and about some choices I made that I deeply regret. I'll give you two some privacy, Sarah began, but Ethan's voice stopped her. Please stay, he said. You're part of this too. The simple acknowledgement, that they were now irreversibly connected, moved Sarah profoundly. As Jackson began the difficult confession of his past choices, Ethan listened with surprising composure, occasionally asking questions that revealed wisdom beyond his years. Did you ever love her? Ethan asked. Jackson considered carefully. I cared for her deeply, but I was in love with a future I'd imagined for myself. I wasn't mature enough to understand that real love requires sacrifice. She sacrificed everything for me, Ethan said, his voice thick with emotion. She worked 2 jobs sometimes. She never bought new clothes so I could have school supplies. She never complained, not once. She's an extraordinary woman, Sarah said softly, surprising herself with the sincerity. I wish I had known her under different circumstances. You saved her life, Ethan reminded her. With the medicine. As the conversation continued into the night, something shifted between the three of them. Not forgiveness exactly, but understanding. Not healing, but the first tentative steps toward it. When Ethan finally went to bed, Sarah and Jackson remained in the living room, the space between them on the couch both physical and emotional. I don't know what happens next, Sarah admitted. Neither do I, Jackson confessed. But for the first time in my life, I'm not trying to control the outcome. I just want to do right by him. By all of us. Sarah reached across the distance, taking his hand for the first time in weeks. That's a start. Ethan? The voice was barely a whisper, raspy from disuse, but it might as well have been a thunderclap in the quiet hospital room. Ethan's head snapped up from his homework, the science textbook tumbling to the floor. Mom? Amy's eyes were open, truly open, aware, focused on her son's face. Her fingers twitched against the blanket, reaching weakly toward him. My baby, she breathed, tears sliding down her pale cheeks. How long was I? 26 days, Ethan said, pressing the nurse call button repeatedly. You've been asleep for almost a month. Amy's gaze drifted around the private hospital room, taking in the comfortable recliner, the vases of fresh flowers, the state-of-the-art equipment. Confusion clouded her features. How are we affording this? She asked, her voice growing stronger. Before Ethan could respond, Dr. Pearson rushed in, followed by two nurses. Their efficient examination pushed Ethan temporarily aside, though he never let go of his mother's hand. I'll call Jackson, Ethan told his mother as the medical team continued their assessment. The name hit Amy like an electric shock. Jackson? Jackson Reed? He's been taking care of me while you were sick, Mom? He knows I'm his son. There was a DNA test and everything. Amy sank back against her pillows, overwhelmed. As Dr. Pearson completed his examination, promising to return with specialists, Ethan made the call that would bring their fragile new world into sharp focus. An hour later, Jackson arrived alone, having left an important investor meeting the moment he received Ethan's call. He hesitated in the doorway, his confident demeanor faltering at the sight of Amy fully conscious. Hello, Amy, he said softly. Jackson. Her voice was neutral, giving nothing away. I'll give you two some privacy, Ethan offered, but both adults immediately protested. Stay, Amy insisted, her hand tightening around her son's. Please, Jackson added. You're the reason we're all here. An uncomfortable silence fell, 8 years of absence hanging in the air between them. Ethan tells me you've been caring for him, Amy finally said. Jackson nodded. He's been staying in our guest house in Brookline. Sarah and I. Sarah? Amy interrupted. The woman who paid for my medication? My wife, Jackson confirmed. It's a rather incredible coincidence. She helped save my life without knowing who I was, Amy mused. That says something about her character. Jackson moved closer. Amy, there's so much to say, so many years to account for. But right now what matters is your recovery. I've arranged for the best rehabilitation specialists, private nursing, whatever you need. I can't accept, Amy began. Yes, you can, Jackson interrupted gently. Not for me, not even for yourself, but for Ethan. Let me do this one thing right after doing so many things wrong. Amy studied him, noting the changes time had brought, success etched in his bearing, but also a new humility in his eyes. I read your letter, Jackson said quietly. The one you never sent. Amy's eyes widened, then shifted to Ethan. You found it? Ethan nodded. I thought Jackson should see it. I suspected you might be pregnant when I left, Jackson admitted, meeting Amy's gaze directly. I told myself it was better for everyone if I stepped away cleanly. I was a coward, Amy. Did you ever think about us? Amy asked, the question she'd held inside for 8 years finally finding voice. Yes, Jackson answered without hesitation. Especially after things took off. I would see children Ethan's age and wonder. But by then I'd convinced myself it was too late. Our lives weren't easy, Amy said simply. But we were happy, weren't we, Ethan? We were, Ethan confirmed. But this past month has been different. Good different in some ways. 2 days later, Sarah visited alone, bringing a small potted orchid. Something that can continue growing, she explained. The two women studied each other, the wife and the former girlfriend, connected by one man and one child. Thank you for taking care of my son, Amy said finally. And for the medicine. I wouldn't be here without you. Ethan is an extraordinary child, Sarah replied. You did an amazing job raising him. How are you not bitter? Sarah asked. I would be furious. Amy considered the question. I was for a long time. But raising Ethan taught me that bitterness is a luxury parents can't afford. Every emotion we hold onto shapes our children's understanding of the world. Sarah found herself drawing closer. I don't know how to navigate this. There's no guidebook for what to do when your husband's child suddenly appears. A small smile lifted Amy's lips. And there's certainly no guidebook for how to co-parent with your ex and his wife after waking from a coma. The shared absurdity of their situation broke the tension, both women finding unexpected laughter. Maybe we write our own rules, Sarah suggested. Day by day. By the following week, Amy had progressed enough to begin physical therapy. The atrophy from her extended hospital stay meant she would need weeks of rehabilitation. I can't impose on you indefinitely, she told Jackson and Sarah during a family meeting in her hospital room. Ethan sat beside her bed, his homework spread across her lap tray. We've been discussing options, Sarah said, surprising Jackson with her use of we. There's a carriage house on our property, separate from both the main house and the guest house. It needs renovation, but it could be perfect for both of you during your recovery. And after? Amy asked carefully. After is up to you, Jackson replied. But we'd like Ethan to remain in his school. He's thriving there. And we'd like to be part of his life. Part of both your lives in whatever way makes sense. Amy looked to Ethan. What do you think, sweetheart? It's a big change. Ethan closed his textbook, considering the three adults watching him. I think that families come in all shapes. And maybe ours is just shaped differently than most. The wisdom from this 8-year-old silenced them all. 1 month later, Amy moved into the renovated carriage house, leaning on a cane but growing stronger each day. The property's layout gave each household privacy while allowing Ethan to move freely between them. Breakfast with his mother, after-school activities with Sarah, weekend projects with Jackson. It wasn't perfect. There were awkward moments, tense conversations, boundaries to be established. But there was also healing, in Amy's strengthening body, in Sarah's softening heart, in Jackson's growing understanding of what truly constituted success. On a warm summer evening, as fireflies began to dot the expansive lawn, the four of them shared a meal that Sarah and Ethan had prepared together. I've been thinking, Jackson said. Reed Enterprises has always had a charitable foundation, but it's been primarily focused on urban development. That's changing, Sarah added. We're establishing a new initiative for single parents facing medical crises, housing assistance, childcare, medical advocacy. The Amy Parker Foundation, Jackson finished, his eyes meeting Amy's across the table. Tears welled in Amy's eyes. You don't have to. We want to, Sarah interjected. Your strength inspired it. Ethan's resilience defined it. And my failure necessitated it, Jackson added quietly. Some good should come from past mistakes. Ethan looked around at the three adults, his mother, his father, and the woman who had become an unexpected ally. None of them were perfect. All of them were trying. Is this what family feels like? He asked suddenly. People who mess up but keep trying anyway? Amy reached for his hand, her eyes full of love. Yes, Ethan. That's exactly what family is. As the sky deepened above them, stars emerging like possibilities, the four figures remained on the patio, not a conventional family but a family nonetheless. Built not on perfect circumstances but on difficult choices, painful honesty, and the courage to begin again. For Ethan, who had once shouted desperately at a millionaire, it was the answer to a question he hadn't known how to ask. For Amy, it was the support she had never expected to find. For Jackson, it was the redemption he hadn't known he needed. And for Sarah, it was the expansion of a heart she thought was already full. New beginnings, it seemed, could emerge from even the most unlikely endings. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more moving narratives. Your thoughts mean the world to us, so share your perspective in the comments below. What was your favorite moment in Ethan's journey from homeless boy to finding a family? Let us know in the comments.